Welcome once again. This is Pinnacle Professional College, and we will be bringing you another lecture on strategy, stakeholders, and mission. We've talked about different things over the last couple of lectures related to the topic, and today we'll be continuing. So if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and please share this video to your friends. I'm sure it'll be very helpful to them. So, in our last lecture, we talked about mission. So today we are going to talk about a vision. A vision is simply a desired future state. A desired future state. So when we talk about a vision, we are looking at a desired future state, an optimal future state. So different organizations would have different visions, just as individuals have their own vision, right? So Microsoft, for instance, has this vision. It says to empower people through great software anytime, any place, and on any device. Anytime, any place, and on any device. So this is the vision of Microsoft. This is the vision of Microsoft. So when we talk about vision, this is exactly what we mean. A vision is different from a mission, right? A mission is simply the purpose of the organization. The vision is the future state, the desired future state of the organization. So what is the relevance of a mission statement, right? A mission statement is basically a formal statement of the purpose of the organization or the reason for the organization's existence. A mission statement would have different purposes, right? Number one is it helps to be consistent with the organization's strategic planning decisions. So what does this mean? What does this mean, right? When an organization is planning or doing their strategy, this strategy should align with the mission of the organization. It should always align with the mission of the organization. This is very, very important. Very, very important. So the mission statement will provide a foundation or a basis for the strategic planning decisions. Remember that when we talked about the hierarchy of goals, it began with what? Mission. It began with mission. So mission is at the top, the mission of the organization. And then whatever strategic planning activities the organization will undertake must align with that mission. Very, very important. Number two is it helps to assist with translating broad intentions into corporate objectives, right? So the mission is quite broad, right? It's quite broad in a sense that it has these broad objectives that it wants to achieve, these broad purposes. What the mission does is that since it's written down in a statement, it helps to translate those broad intentions into some viable specific objectives. It also provides a common purpose for every individual in the organization. So if you're working for whatever firm you are working on for, whether it's KPMG, whether it's MTN, whatever the company is, once you know their mission, it sort of gives the people in there, a common purpose. It also serves as inspiration for the employees, right? The mission also would provide the goals and ethics of the organization. It establishes the goals and ethics of the organization. Another key thing I need to explain when it comes to the importance or the relevance of the mission statement is that it also helps stakeholders to have an understanding of the organization. So for instance, if I know the mission of the World Bank is to reduce poverty, me as an outsider, me as a stakeholder, I know exactly, the World Bank's objectives. I have an understanding of what they want to achieve, and then I can offer my support as much as I can. So these are some of the importance of mission statements, very, very important. Then you have goals and objectives, right? Someone might say goals and objectives are the same, right? But goals and objectives are two different things. Goals and objectives are two different things. So goals are basically aims, right? These are aims that are expressed in narrative terms. In other words, goals are broad aims. Broad aims, that's how I'll put it. These are broad aims, right? That is a goal. But an objective is basically a derivative of a goal. An objective is a derivative of a goal and are more measurable, or they can be measured. So what's the difference here? A goal is a broad aim. An objective is a more specific aim, right? It's a more specific aim which can be measured. Very, very important. Very, very important. Anytime you hear the word goal, you should know that it's broad. So for example, maximization of shareholder wealth. That's a broad goal. An objective would be more specific. An objective would be expressed in a form that is measurable. That is measurable. That's why we have these acronyms for objectives. We say all objectives should be SMART. Objectives should be SMART. So what does this mean? It should be specific, it should be measurable, it should be agreed, it should be realistic, and it should be time-bound. It should be time-bound. That's on objectives. Objectives are specific aims derived from goals, which are broad aims. So the objective should be specific. You should know exactly what we are talking about. It should be stated clearly. It should be measurable. You can measure the objective. It should be agreed. It should be realistic, and it should be time-bound, right? There should be a specific time set for its achievement. So this is a difference between goals and objectives. It's important to keep that in mind because it usually trips up a lot of people. So who decides mission, goals, and objectives? Who decides mission, goals, and objectives? When an entity states its mission in a mission statement, the statement is issued by the leaders of the entity. So these are the top guys. For a company, this will be the board. Similarly, the formal goals and objectives of an entity are stated by its leaders. So when you look at the mission is usually issued by the leaders of the entity. Usually issued by the leaders of the entity. However, it says the decisions by a board of directors about the goals and objectives of an entity are influenced by the way in which the company is governed and the expectations of other stakeholders. I think we've sort of discussed this in previous lectures, right? But what you need to know is that the mission is sort of designed, issued by the leaders of the entity, Very, very important. Now let's move on to stakeholder and stakeholder expectations. Stakeholder and stakeholder expectations. Under stakeholder and stakeholder expectations, we'll be discussing who stakeholders are, their expectations. We'll be talking about stakeholder mapping. We're looking at the importance and position of stakeholders. We'll also be looking at the power and interest of stakeholders, as well as explain the cultural context within which stakeholders operate. So this is very, very important. Very, very important. Now, let's define stakeholders. Who are stakeholders? The stakeholders in an entity are any individuals, groups of individuals, or external organizations that have an interest in what the organization is trying to achieve. So two words here, stake and holders. So these people have a stake in the organization. These are people who are influenced by or affected by the strategy of the organization. They have an interest in what the organization is trying to achieve. One of the things you should know here is that not all stakeholders are the same. Some have more influence than others. Some have more influence than others and can affect the organization in much larger proportions than others. So let's give some examples of stakeholders. Some examples of stakeholders. So you have shareholders, you have lenders, you have suppliers, you have directors, you have the government, you have pressure groups, anybody within the internal and external environment who has an interest in what the organization is trying to achieve is a stakeholder. It's a stakeholder. So listed here are many stakeholders. You have the investment community, you have local communities, pressure groups, government, directors, employees. All of these are stakeholders. As I mentioned, the influence and significance of each stakeholder group differs. Okay, so let's move on to the expectations of stakeholders. The expectations of stakeholders. So every stakeholder has a different expectation. Everybody has their own interest, as people say. So are stakeholders. They have their own interest. Right? And the traditional view of corporate governance or corporate administration is that the main stakeholders are the shareholders, the board of directors, and the senior managers, right? So that's the traditional view. But let's look at what the rights, the duties, and expectations of these stakeholders are. Very important. So let's look at the shareholders, for instance. What are the rights of shareholders? Think about what are the rights of shareholders. The shareholders have the right to vote. So they are voting to decide on matters affecting the organization. So shareholders have that, right? What is their duty? Their duty is to ensure that the right people or the appropriate people are elected as directors. You have to know that the shareholders are not involved in the day-to-day running of the company, right? They appoint directors who will do that. So one of their duties is to ensure that the appropriate people are elected as directors. And then you have expectations. Expectations. What are the expectations of shareholders? Right? If you are a shareholder and you have invested your money into a company, what will be your expectation? What would be your expectation? Your expectation would be you would want a return on your investment, you want stable dividends, right? And you want share price growth. These are some of the things you would want because you've put in your money, you would want some return. So that's it with shareholders. Now, when we move on to directors, directors have no rights, but extensive powers are given to them by the board, right? And then when it comes to duties, the directors have a duty of care and skill. They are supposed to bring their skill to bear when managing the affairs of the company. The directors have been appointed by someone, and therefore they must ensure that they abide by such appointments and that they must take care and run the business properly. So what are the expectations of the director? The director expects that they'll advance within the company, they'll make more money, which is remuneration, and overall their status within the company would be increased, would be increased. And then you have senior managers, right? Senior managers. Senior managers, in terms of their rights, they have what we call employment rights that every employee would have. Then in terms of their duties, they have a duty to carry out their delegated tasks in the organization. Senior managers, just like directors, would also have a need or an expectation for personal advancement, remuneration, status, etc. Now let's move on to other stakeholders, because there are many of them. But let's look at some stakeholders and see also what the expectations are. For example, if you're an employee who is employees are stakeholders as well, what they are looking for is a good pay, good working conditions, job security, and career progression. These are what employees are looking for in an organization. It's very, very important. And then if you look at customers are looking for value. So they are expecting that the goods or services that you sell to them are good enough or provide good value for their money. Suppliers also expect that, their business relationship with you would be amicable, would be good, and that if they sell anything to you on credit, you pay them back. Right. So these are all expectations. These are all expectations. For example, another expectation of the community in which the organization operates is that they expect the company to provide employment in that local vicinity or area. Right. The government is also another stakeholder. The government would also be interested in the fact that the company pays their taxes, helps to protect the environment, reduce pollution, etc. Now, depending on the power of these stakeholders, they can influence strategic decisions of a company. Right? They can influence. So, for example, the government has a lot of power. So this power and influence of stakeholders vary, as I've already mentioned. They vary from stakeholders to stakeholder. So as you've seen, you can group stakeholders into two broad categories. Number one is stakeholders within an entity. Stakeholders within an entity. Or internal stakeholders. That's how you can call them. You can call them stakeholders within an entity or internal stakeholders, and stakeholders outside of an entity or external stakeholders, right? So these stakeholders within an entity include shareholders, senior managers, middle managers, employees, etc. Very, very important. Very, very important. The power of these stakeholders would come from their control over decision-making processes, their position in the hierarchy, their knowledge and skills, their influence, their control over resources, etc. But what you need to know is that they are internal stakeholders, people within the organization that have an interest in what the organization wants to achieve. Now you have external stakeholders. These include lenders, suppliers, customers, the government, right? And where does their power come from? Their power could come from the laws of the land, right? The government would have laws, and that's where it derives its power from. And for example, a supplier or a customer would derive its power from the fact that a company depends on it, right? If I'm a supplier and the company depends on my raw materials, then I have a lot of power and a lot of say. You know, it's very, very important. Very, very important. So you have two groups. You have internal stakeholder and then you have external stakeholders. Keep that in mind, please. It's very, very important. Now let's move on to stakeholder mapping. Stakeholder mapping. Now, what is stakeholder mapping? Right? When we say stakeholder mapping, basically we are trying to list all of our stakeholders and understand the power or interest they yield on our organization. We list all our stakeholders and try to understand the power and the interest they yield or they have over our organization. Very, very important. Because the whole idea of this is to manage your stakeholders, particularly those with greatest influence. So what's the stakeholder map? As the text is saying, the stakeholder map is simply a diagram that shows the main stakeholders and their relative significance, right? It's very, very important. So that's what a stakeholder map is. You know all your stakeholders, and then you try and figure out how significant they are in terms of power or interest. Now, there are a number of different stakeholder maps. There are so many. There are mainly two of them. Sorry, there are mainly two of them. The first one is the stakeholder power importance matrix. The second one is the stakeholder, no, sorry. The first one is the stakeholder position importance matrix. And the second one is the power interest matrix. The most familiar one, which I've seen used over and over again, is the power interest matrix, which is associated with Mendeley. So, and it's usually called the Mendeley matrix. It's usually called the Mendeley matrix. So the power interest matrix is associated with Mendeley, but there are fundamentally like two of them. There's a power interest matrix and there's the position importance matrix. So let's move on and try and understand these matrices. First of all, we'll try and understand the position importance matrix. The position importance matrix. This matrix compares the position of the stakeholders on a particular issue on a scale, right? So this is a very interesting one. If you frequent management meetings or even team meetings, which involves different people within your department, right? Let's say your director, your manager, and other lower level staff, you would realize that there are different positions and therefore there are different relative importance of the people in that meeting. So here we have a matrix that looks at stakeholders. First, it looks at the position of the stakeholders on a particular issue. And then it looks at the relative importance of those stakeholders. Right. So how does it do this? It looks at the position of the stakeholders on the issue on a scale of +5 to -5. So you have +5 is strong opposition, -5 is what? Strong support. Strong support. Right. So +5 is what? +5 is strong support. Sorry. +5 is strong support. -5 is strong opposition. +5 is strong support. -5 is strong opposition. And then you have on the relative importance scale, -5 is not important and +5 is very important. Right. So what is the position of the stakeholder on the issue? So let's say they are discussing, let's say they want to venture into a new market, right? They look at the different stakeholders and they look at employees. What is their take on the issue? And maybe their take is, let's say two, right? So 2 means that they are closer to support, right? But in terms of their importance is -3, which is they are not really that important. It's just an example, right? But I'm just trying to paint a picture of how this looks. So this is a matrix, like we said. So you have importance of the stakeholder and the position on the issue, right? So you have 4 different categories. You have the problematic category, you have the antagonistic category, you have the low priority category, and then you have the supporter category. Very, very important. Very, very important. So what's this all about? What's this all about? Right? Let's look at the problematic category first off. In the problematic category, you would realize that this is at the top left corner. The top left corner. You would see that at the corner, you would see that on the importance matrix, in the far corner, it's -5. It's -5. So it means that they are not that important. On the position side, right? And the top left corner is also -5, right? So what does that mean? That also means that they offer strong opposition. So these are problematic people. So problematic people, in that sense, are people of low importance, low relative importance, and are strong opposers. Low relative importance and strong opposers. Very crucial. Then on the antagonistic side, you realize that the importance has shifted to +5. The importance has shifted to +5. So these are very important stakeholders, but are also strong opposers. So those are antagonistic people. And then for low priority people, you would realize that you have +5 at the bottom, which means support, right? Which means support. And then you have -5, which means you have -5, which means they are not that important. Please follow me carefully. So low priority people are people who have, who are supportive of the ideas. They are very supportive, but they are not that important. They are very supportive, but they are not that important. And then in the last quadrant is supporter. A supporter is someone who is very important and also is a strong supporter. It's very important and a strong supporter. So this is a brief explanation of the position importance matrix. If you want to use a simple way to remember this, right? I always advocate for acronyms. It's plus. So PL, so problematic, low priority. Problematic starts with a P. So problematic, low priority starts with an L. So PLAS. A stands for antagonistic, S stands for supporter. So PLAS, which is plus. And then you can easily Remember it. All you need is your -5 plus 5 at the top and on the side, and that's it. But more importantly, it's important to understand these concepts. So let's read, the narrative here. I think it's very, very important. The map which we discussed above can be used by the directors to assess the action they should take to try and win each stakeholder group. They should give more attention to the important stakeholders. In the matrix shown here, the main concern should be to deal with the stakeholders who are strongly opposed to the proposed plans of the board and are antagonistic. Do you see? So the antagonistic people are the ones who are at the top right corner. Those are the antagonistic people. The director should consider what measures should be taken to try to reduce the opposition of these stakeholders. And why are we trying to win the heart of the antagonistic folks? Because they are very important. If you look at the top, they are +5. They are very important. Their decision would be influenced by what the consequences for the company might be if the stakeholders remain antagonistic. So it's always important to have a compromise with antagonistic people. Management should also try to win the support from the problematic stakeholders, although their opposition is relatively unimportant. Yeah. So we discussed this. The problematic folks are the ones who are strong opposers, but they are not important. They should maintain the goodwill of supporters. Supporters are those who are on your side and those who are important as well. So supporters are really good people. They are really good people. So I hope you understood the matrix. If you have any questions on the matrix, which is the position importance matrix, you can drop a comment and I'll gladly explain it. I'll gladly explain it. So let's move on to Mendelow's stakeholder power interest matrix. This is a similar way of thinking, but Mendelow looks at it differently. He looks at it from the interest of the stakeholder and the power of the stakeholder. The interest of the stakeholder on a particular issue ranges from 0 to 10. 0 means very low, 10 is very high, and that's what it means. So in the first quadrant here, you realize that the first quadrant says minimal effort. So for stakeholders who have a low power, their influence is not that great or that high, and they are also not interested. You don't spend much time on them. You only allocate minimal effort, small effort to them because they don't have much power and they don't have much interest. You see? And then those who are have a lot of power but low interest, you just keep them satisfied. So you see that in the second quadrant below minimal effort. They are strong, is 10, but they are also very, very low in interest. So you just keep them satisfied. For those who have high interest and low power, you keep them informed because they're interested. When somebody is interested in a topic, you inform them, you communicate with them, you talk to them, right? And then for those who have high power and high interest, these are what we call key players. These are very, very strategic people. You would want to focus a lot more on them. So that's Mendelow's power interest matrix. So the strength of the interest of a stakeholder group in the strategic decisions by the company will depend on the expectations, right? So in Mendelow's matrix, what is interesting is that the recommended course of action is defined in each quadrant. So for example, those who have no power, the stakeholders who have no power and no interest, we allocate only a minimal effort to them. We don't pay attention that much to them. Those who are strong stakeholders but have very low interest, you keep them satisfied. Those who have high interest and low power, you keep them informed. Those who have high power and high interest, those are key players. That's very important. Now let's talk about stakeholder influence and look at it from a cultural perspective. Right. And one thing you need to understand is that the stakeholders and their interests will vary according to the culture or the region or the country from which it operates. So the interest of stakeholders in America is different from the interest of stakeholders in Ghana. It's very, very important. Very, very important. So this is something that you need to know. Culture always influences stakeholder interest. Culture always influences stakeholder interest. Very, very important. Now, this is where we'll bring this discussion on strategy, stakeholders, and mission. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to do a couple of things. You should be able to define strategy, talk about strategic management. You should be able to understand strategic planning, long-term planning. You should be able to understand the approaches to strategic planning. You should know the levels of strategy. You should be able to distinguish between vision, mission, goals, objectives, etc. And you should also be able to explain stakeholder maps, and basically give 2 examples of stakeholder matrices. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you haven't subscribed, please do so and share this with your friends. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.